Well, thank you very much for coming along. It's a great pleasure to be here for my first rededication ceremony. It's amazing to think it's been going on for 20 years. Of course, I had only just been born when this started, and so it's very nice to come along. And it's a pleasure to bring along my wife Susan and my son Ben as well, and to be here with my dad Peter. So I've heard many things about this particular rededication ceremony, and everyone has just talked about how much it brings to the life of Spring Hill in Grendon. And this Buddha Grove itself is such a beautiful and peaceful place, and I think that beauty and peace permeates throughout the whole of the organisation, throughout the whole of Spring Hill. So it has a very special place in our hearts, and you know, like I said, it's an absolute privilege to be able to come along here tonight, and I very much look forward to this being my first, but by no means my last. And I look forward to coming again year after year. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a very good evening.
One thing about being the ex-governor is that you don't expect to have to make a speech. So I am completely and utterly unprepared. However, it's not difficult for me because there's something very special about this occasion. I remember on a chilly September evening in 2002, when I came here as the new governor of Grendon and Spring Hill, and that in fact was my first duty, if we can call it a duty. The first thing I did here at Grendon and Spring Hill was to attend this rededication and to say a few words. Since then, I think it's 10. I was here as the governor, and now, of course, it's my 11th time now as the ex-governor. It has been very special, and as the current governor has said, there's something very special about how this occasion is is woven in to the culture of Spring Hill. I know that I will always want to be invited back here, and it's interesting that I keep thinking of this, it keeps coming up in my mind. I know that only 3 weeks ago I was doing prison work in China, and I just visited a high security prison there, and then was whisked off to something which I hadn't expected, but to a pagoda there in Xi'an, in Shanxi province, and I was so surprised to hear that that pagoda was one of the sacred scriptures that the great Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang had gathered from India in one of his momentous journeys there about 14 or 1500 years ago. And I don't know if I can make that any kind of meaningful link in my short speech, except that I suppose there's something imprinted in me that I have an association there with the Buddha and prisons, rising from Spring Hill, but also there in Xi'an when I saw the pagoda coming so hard on my visiting a high security prison. So I think this is a wonderful occasion, and I shouldn't say any more.
And I was reflecting, that's a quarter of my lifetime. Because at the time that we celebrated that opening of the Buddha Grove, we actually were marking what was a remarkable occasion, and that was the construction of this Buddha Grove by the prisoners who were serving their sentences here at the time, and particularly, as we've heard mentioned, of Sam Cutler, who I think was doing 9 years, and who was the inspiration behind the building of this Buddha Grove, who, as you've heard, went to the then governor, Tim Newell, perhaps not knowing how it would turn out, that this would be a great thing to have in Spring Hill here. I don't think that Sam Cutler would have imagined what the consequences were of that. This Buddha Grove was the first of many throughout the prison system, but also that it would be a symbol of what Buddhism can do for prisoners. I think there's no doubt at all that it brings enormous benefits to people who look at the advice of the Buddha, and indeed that doesn't apply only to prisoners but to the whole of the community. When you think of the Buddha's message that we should try to conquer the three evils of greed, hatred and delusion, and you see how that applies to our present day society. Greed, the greed of the bankers, the greed of MPs and peers taking allowances that they weren't entitled to. Hatred that inspires people to commit atrocious offences against fellow human beings all over the world. Surely the message of the Buddha applies not just to prisons, but to everybody in the community. But I'd like to, while I have the opportunity, say thank you to Bante for the inspiration he gave to the opening of this Buddha Grove and to what he does for the prison chaplaincy Angulimala. And I think that's of inestimable benefit, and one that could not possibly have been foreseen by Sam Cutler 21 years ago. The Buddhist prison chaplaincy does a fantastic job, and not only in Spring Hill but throughout the prison system, and I'd like to pay tribute to Bante and to the Sangha as a whole for the support that they give to this occasion and to all the work that they do in promoting the message of the Buddha throughout the prison system. May I also say thank you particularly to the Thai community for all the support they give to this occasion on so many occasions, with a wonderful dinner that we're about to have after this ceremony. And finally, if I may, I'd like to thank my old friend Prince Gunasekara, who I first met in 1971 when he was an MP in Sri Lanka, and was a great fighter for human rights when there were something like 15,000 young people detained without trial in that country. He and I went round Sri Lanka together looking at what was happening, and it was because of the conversations that I had with Prince at that time that I turned towards Buddhism and I'm most grateful to him for having given me that opportunity. But thank you all for the support that you give to this fantastic occasion, and for the many times that we've met here to celebrate the original opening of this Buddha Grove. May we meet here many more times in the future, and may the message go out from our occasion to the rest of the prison system that Buddhism has something to offer which is of great benefit to the whole of our community.
We've heard the hallowed name of Sam Cutler mentioned several times already this evening. Sam Cutler he was here for about 2 years, and at one time, prior to his imprisonment and prior to embarking on the crime that brought him here, he had been the road manager for the Rolling Stones and the Grateful Dead. I have a picture of him puffing on a fag with Mick Jagger. Sam Cutler was an extraordinary chap, really. I mean, he was quite a rough diamond in a way, and I couldn't quite get my head round it one day when he announced that his wife was doing a PhD in Pali studies at Oxford. It just didn't sort of add up. This chap was married to a woman doing Pali at Oxford, but anyway, it was quite true. And not only that, for the Thai people who can understand me, but his wife is a friend of Prateep. And I have a picture of his wife and Prateep. Prateep is the princess, the very popular daughter of the King of Thailand. And I have a picture also of Sally and Prateep together. And it was all quite true. But when he told me, I couldn't really quite believe it. Anyway, we were seated in the boardroom over there one day, unforgettable day, and I'm afraid quite often, some prisoners have a habit of complaining about the facilities, and that day they were voicing their discontent with some vigour because we had nowhere to meet. The Buddhists had nowhere to meet, and they were not happy at all about it. And suddenly Sam Cutler said, well, he said, there's not much space inside, but there's a lot of space outside. And it turned out that Sam had been thinking about this and thinking about establishing a place outside, not inside a building, but outside. And he'd had his eye on this grove of trees. And he announced that he'd like to have what he called a Buddha grove in this grove of trees. He said it was really well placed, just under the eye of the governor's office, so he'd be influenced by it. and so I said, okay, well, you know, see what the governor says. So off he went to Tim York, and I very rashly said that I would get a Buddha image from Thailand. I wasn't quite sure how I was going to manage it, but anyway, that's what I promised. And he went off to see Tim Newell. And Tim Newell, I presume, thought that this was just going to be quite a modest construction, probably just a Buddha image under the tree. So he said yes. And, well, a few weeks later I came back here, and there's concrete being mixed and prisoners pushing barrows, and it was a building site. Much more than we'd ever expected. And anyway, I had to fulfill my promise to bring a Buddha image from Thailand. Well, this is not an easy thing to accomplish. But luckily, one day, a woman came to visit me, and I told her what I needed, and she said, okay, I'll arrange it. And she did. But actually getting a Buddha image, and especially a big and rather beautiful one, out of Thailand is difficult. There are laws which say you can't do it without a proper license. And I got back from one of my prison visits one day, and on my voicemail there was a message saying that this Buddha image was at Bangkok airport, but they wouldn't let it go. Next message, it had gone. It had taken off, but they didn't know where. So that was Thursday. Saturday morning, I found it at Birmingham airport. Very fortunately, that Saturday morning, I had a man from the Royal Thai Embassy visiting with his wife. So I put on my most pathetic sort of expression, and I went and said, I've got this problem, I've got this big Buddha image at Bangkok, at Birmingham airport, and I don't quite know what to do about it. So he whips out his mobile phone, which in those days were not common things, and a few minutes later we were in his Merc and off up the motorway to Birmingham. Well, when we got there, we were then faced with all these forms you have to fill in. And usually you employ a company to do this because it's very difficult. If you know the codes, it's quite easy, but if you don't, it's a very complex business. And we didn't know any of this. So we sat down, there were three of us, sitting down at this table with all these forms, and we could have been there hours. But then it was like a deva appeared. There was a clip-clop up the stairs. This young woman came in. She saw our problem. She said, you do this, you do that, you do that. And within 5 minutes, we'd filled in those forms, and she disappeared. And we presented the forms, and a little later on that afternoon, we were processing up the hill, the Merc and a van behind it with the Buddha in it. And we came in and we presented it to the small Buddhist group. And off I went. 2 or 3 days later, I came back for one of my usual visits. And Sam Cutler met me somewhere around here. He said, "Boy, come here." And he took me round the back there to one of the sort of outbuildings. And I always have to warn the Thai and Burmese people at this point in the story to just sort of don't get too alarmed. Because he took me into this building, and to my absolute horror, there was the Buddha image upside down. It was very well supported and all that, but it was upside down, and there was this chap standing above it, shoveling concrete into it, because originally it was hollow. So he was shoveling tons of concrete into the Buddha image, and there were these 2 metal posts protruding. When I came down here, this is very solid. If any governor thinks he's going to move this, he'll need quite a bit of Semtex to shift it, I can tell. And there were 2 holes, and the idea was that these metal bars would drop into the holes. But the next problem, which they hadn't quite sort of thought about, was that when the Buddha was full of concrete, it was immensely heavy. And it took the strongest men in the camp to get it out of that building. Just at that time, the new huts, well, they're not so new now, but they were new then, were being built, and there was a big trench along here, and there was a JCB on site. So the JCB was commandeered to lift the Buddha image, and it was rocking as it lifted it. It was rocking. It could barely do it, but it managed it, and it lifted it and dropped it into those 2 holes, the bars into those 2 holes. So it's very, very well constructed. I'm occasionally in contact with Sam Cutler. Sam Cutler emigrated after he left this place. His wife was Australian, and when she'd finished her PhD in Pali, they went to Australia to live, and that's where he is now. And I contacted him. He's on Facebook. He's a very, very popular man. He's got over 5,000 friends on Facebook. He's absolutely full. I couldn't get on. So anyway, I contacted him and I said, can we have a message? So this is what I got, all the way from Australia, via Facebook. I can do a reasonable imitation of Sam, but I'll restrain myself. It's hard to imagine that the Earth has gone round the Sun 20 times since prisoners at HMP Spring Hill built the Buddha Grove, with a lot of help from the then Governor and his staff and from Buddhists in the community. The whole project was overseen by the senior Buddhist monk Lumpur Khemadamo, who encouraged us at every step of the way and was kindness personified. There's not many people that say that anymore, but anyway, it's very kind of them. I'd like it known that this place was built by prisoners of many faiths, including Hindu and Muslim, and we all worked together in a great spirit of cooperation and understanding, when at that time virtually none but Christians had any facilities in prison. The Buddha Grove was the first of its kind, and now there are similar places in many prisons throughout the country. May any benefit this place brings to people be shared as widely as possible. Prisons are not happy places, needless to say. But whether we are in them for a year or a life sentence, we need to think about how we arrived at this place and how we are going to leave it. I was here at HMP Spring Hill for almost 2 years. Not the happiest time of my life, but I made the best of it. What else can we do? Live and learn, and hopefully grow a little wiser in the process. I now live in Australia, but before I die it is my firm intention to once more visit what we built all those years ago. I'd better not see you there. Meaning that once in this place is more than enough. Sam had this sort of vision of a Buddha field, he called it, and he felt that if there was the presence of the Buddha image here, it would radiate and change the feel of the place, the whole vibe of the place. I don't know whether people agree with that, but certainly it's made this place, this prison, a different prison. And of course we've been able every year to have a very special occasion when this is not at all like a prison. I go to many prisons, and I've been doing it for many years, and none of my prison visits are like this evening here. I want to just say a little bit more about Angulimala, the Buddhist Prison Chaplaincy, because this is a kind of flagship occasion for us. It's a chance for us to just show a little bit of what we do. I've been coming into the prisons now since 1977. I'd just come back from Thailand. I came with Ajahn Chah on a visit. It was supposed to be a 2-month visit. It took me 9.5 years to get back to Thailand. But anyway, within a few weeks of arriving, we had some calls. A phone call from Holloway, a phone call from Pentonville, and a letter from Parkhurst, all wanting someone to visit the Buddhist inmates. And really it was kind of down to me. There was no one else available, so I thought, well, I'd quite like to do this. On a train one day, on my way south with Ajahn Chah, just he and I asked him if I could do it. I asked his permission. He answered with one word: "Bye." Means go. So that was it. I started going to prisons, and it's 35 years have gone by, and I'm still going to prisons. I was in this boardroom about a year ago, 18 months ago, talking to some men. One of them said to me, he said, "Where do you see yourself in about 10 years' time?" I said, "Here." Because I don't see myself doing anything much different. In 1985, we decided that we should try and offer our services to the prisons in a rather more organised fashion. So we founded Angulimala, the Buddhist Prison Chaplaincy. And our aim was to make Buddhism available in the prisons of this country. And we decided to call it Buddhist Prison Chaplaincy after one of the Buddha's great disciples, a man called Angulimala. And it's a very well-known story, this man. He was a terrible man. But he began his life, according to the commentaries, as a very fine, upright young man, a very brilliant young man. He was a student at the sort of Oxbridge of India, at Tuxedo. And he was so bright that he incurred the jealousy of his fellow students. And they decided to poison the teacher's mind against him. They didn't like him, and they wanted to make life rather difficult for him and destroy him, really. And eventually they succeeded. They told stories about him, and eventually they succeeded in causing the teacher to ask of this young student, whose name, by the way, at the time was Ahingsaka, the harmless one, to ask of this student what he must have thought was an impossible honorarium before he could graduate. He asked of this student 1,000 right-hand human little fingers. And we can only think that he thought that this boy would just give up and go home. But he was a very bright student and a very dedicated one, and he always did his best to please his teachers. And so off he went to try and get these 1,000 right-hand human little fingers. And very quickly he must have discovered that people don't give up their little fingers willingly. So he had to resort to violence and to murder. And he became very good at it. He was a very powerful, very athletic figure, and the scriptures, the Buddhist scriptures, describe bands of men being sent against him, and they all came off worse, and their fingers ended up on the garland which he wove around his neck. He had nowhere to keep these fingers, so he put them on a cord and wove it as a garland around his neck. And from that he got this name, Angulimala. It means finger garland. He became quite well known, very well known, and much feared. Now a portion of the Buddhist scriptures opens with the Buddha one day, after the meal, leaving the monastery and going out and crossing the fields and walking in the direction of the great forest in which Angulimala lived. And various people at work called out to him to warn him that in that forest lived Angulimala. But the Buddha ignored them, and he carried on, and he entered that forest. Now that day, Angulimala had round his neck 999 human right-hand little fingers. He only needed one more to complete his score. And looking out from his lair, he spotted the Buddha entering the forest. So he grabbed his weapons and he dashed out, intent on murdering the Buddha and taking that last finger. But then a very strange thing happened. Now he was a very powerful person, very athletic. But that day, however hard he ran, however hard he tried to catch up with the Buddha, he couldn't. And the Buddha appeared to be walking quite calmly through that forest path. Eventually, Angulimala, soaked in sweat, angry, frustrated, called out to the Buddha to stop. And the Buddha turned and said to him, I have stopped, Angulimala. I have stopped. Now it's for you. I have stopped killing and harming. Now it's your turn. And Angulimala was utterly shocked by this. He was used to people being terrified of him. He was used to people using violence against him. But that day, this man, alone and unarmed, was standing there with neither fear nor anger, and he was quite overwhelmed. And he stopped. And this encounter ended with him throwing away those weapons and meekly following the Buddha back to the monastery, where he became the Buddha's monk. Now, news of what had happened didn't leak out immediately. And back in the main city, in front of the king's palace, people were agitating for the king to do something about this terrible person. So eventually the king rode out with his cavalry, intent on capturing Angulimala and executing him. And the king was a very pious monarch, very devoted to the Buddha, and so as they rode past the monastery where the Buddha lived, he dismounted and he went in to pay his respects and to tell the Buddha what he was doing. And the Buddha said to him, he said, "What would you say? What would you do, great king, if I were to tell you that here amongst these monks sat Angulimala?" And the king said, "Well, naturally, of course, I pay my respect, but it's utterly impossible that such a terrible person could be here amongst all these wonderful monks of yours." And with that, the Buddha stretched forth his right arm and he pointed. "Here, sir, here sits Angulimala." And the scriptures say that the king's knees knocked and he rapidly remembered he had urgent business elsewhere. But before he left, he went to Angulimala, paid his respects, spoke to him, and then he came back to the Buddha and he said, "It is wonderful, it is marvelous, what we have failed to do with weapons and with violence, you have achieved with neither weapons nor violence." And he left. And he left Angulimala to work out his own salvation, which he did in time. And he eventually became one of the Arahants. He became one of the enlightened persons. Now this is a very powerful story. It reminds us that even in the most extreme of circumstances, people do and will change. And I know that in the prisons, because I've heard it in the past, often people have a mind that they never change. They never change. Well, they do. People do change, and we must never forget that. We're all changing. Everything is changing. And we all have the ability to grow and to develop and to be quite different persons if we're not imprisoned by views and opinions of others. So it's important to remember that. That's one thing we need to remember from this story. Another is, well, people often ask, how was it possible that this happened? Well, that day, Angulimala met a person who had no fear, who had no anger. He was used to dealing with violence, he was used to dealing with people who were frightened of him, but he wasn't used to dealing with someone who had a pure mind. Change comes about not by force, it comes about by example and persuasion. And the best example we can give is the example of a developed mind, just as the Buddha that day showed that man a mind free of greed, hatred and delusion. So I won't keep you any longer from this wonderful meal which is waiting for you down the road. But I hope you'll remember some of what I've just said, and I'm very pleased to see you here, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the occasion. And I hope that, and I'm talking now to some of our residents, that you'll all come back after the meal and join us here for a procession. We walk around this Buddha grove 3 times with candles and incense and flowers, and it's a very beautiful and wonderful occasion, and I hope that you'll all be here for that. So thank you all very much, and enjoy the food, and I'll see you here a bit later on. And please, residents, can you guide our guests down to the dining hall?